When does all the teamwork really lead to change? I want to let that sit just for a second. When does all the teamwork really lead to change? And what do we need to do in order for all this teamwork to really lead to change? Those are the conversations and questions we hope to somewhat answer in today's back and forth, a conversation specifically about police accountability and reform in America, a topic that is all on our minds right now for various reasons. And we're going to get into that. To share the good work and provide some insight as we look to answer those questions, we have called on the expertise of the Justice Collaborative. The Justice Collaborative does a lot of things, but at the core of everything, the group works to create systemic change in vulnerable communities. Plain and simple, they help those who need it most. Part of that work includes police reform and accountability. Marisa Lee is a senior advisor to the Justice Collaborative, and she is who we are going to turn to today for advice and, more importantly, a charge, Marisa, our charge to act and be the change that we want to see. We so appreciate your time.
This is great. I am really glad you all invited me today. And, this is a very, very important and timely conversation. I am speaking to another Black woman, so I know I don't have to tell you that, but I'll say it anyway. So thank you for having me. Let's do this.
And there's a reason why police reform and accountability gets its own section in today's summit. There's been a push to reevaluate law enforcement in this country, but the push is not necessarily new. Why is that sense of urgency, though, happening now?
I will tell you from my personal perspective, in addition to the work that I do in the criminal justice reform space and around racial equity issues more broadly, I also do a lot of work in the space around grief and loss. And I feel like, America is living through a very unique time. I think this country was thrust into this moment of grief at the onset of, a relatively unexpected global pandemic. And we were all, at home, working from home, trying to manage our lives in the midst of COVID-19 when we watched a man be publicly executed in broad daylight on television. And I feel like for those of us in the Black community, and I'll speak specifically about myself, I had become a little bit numb, frankly, to these types of things happening because we've seen them over and over and over again. They just feel like something that I have come to expect, unfortunately. But there was something about the murder of George Floyd that I think really shook people. I think because we weren't distracted by normal life, a lot of people who are not typically paying attention to these things sat up and said, oh my God, that happened, and wanted to do something and are trying to figure out, where to put their time, where to put their energy, where to put their financial resources right now. So, that's why I think we're in this place that we're in today.
And we're going to get to what people can do and where they can put their time and resources, because I know a lot of people are feeling that helplessness, and we're definitely going to get to some action items. But I feel like history is important. Context is important, right? So the next part of this conversation is the history of policing in this country. Marisa, where do you even start to explain the reason for its inception, the reason that police were created?
Slavery. Many early police forces actually started out as slave patrols. White men between the ages of 18 and 45 were given license to go out and capture Black people, who they presumed had run away from their masters, but, who knows? So that is the origin of the institution. And it really hit home for me this summer. I called my grandfather on his 99th birthday, and he felt like he needed to remind me that, if I get pulled over, if I have any encounter with law enforcement, that I just do what they say. He said, do what they tell you to do, because otherwise they're going to hurt you. That is the doctrine that he has had to carry his entire life, growing up in the Jim Crow South and, moving through the Great Migration to New York, and even having been living most of his life in the North. Like, that is how he feels about police. And unfortunately, we are continuing to remind him that that is the case. So, it is an institution that, for better or worse, is rooted in our racist, slave owning history. And I think in order to properly reform that institution, we have to acknowledge that past and acknowledge the origins.
As we aim to educate people today and eventually empower them, there's three different topics that I know you felt like were important to address: public safety, the vision for police accountability, right? What that could and should look like, and then the role that race plays in all of this. And you talked about it a little bit in the origin of police as an institution. Let's start here. What is your definition of public safety? That sounds so much more hopeful than law enforcement, doesn't it? When we say public safety, yeah, it feels like somebody's protecting us.
When I hear public safety, I think of wealthy, frankly, predominantly white suburbs that I've spent time in. I spent 4 years at Harvard surrounded by wealth and privilege and all sorts of access. And when I would go to places like Fairfield County, Connecticut, one of the wealthiest counties in the country, I definitely felt safe. I didn't see a big police presence, but I felt safe, because what public safety is really connected to is intentional and sustained community investment. It is not, for better or worse, about having, cops on every corner. It's about investing in, what a community looks like, and things like public parks and, beautiful green spaces where children and adults can spend time and be in community with one another. It's about investing in things like trauma reduction programs and violence reduction programs. It's about investing in, mental health services and public education. Another thing that this pandemic has reminded us is that we have consistently underinvested in public education, which unfortunately tends to lead to violent outcomes. Public safety is just, it's not about policing. Nationwide, on average, last year, police were able to solve 5% of violent crimes in this country. If they're only solving 5% of violent crimes, I just don't know how we can make the argument that they are the thing that we need to keep us safe.
What I found so poignant from what you just talked about when you mentioned public safety is the place that you felt most safe, there wasn't a huge police presence. I'm not saying that to say, how much police are needed or not. I'm just saying that was very interesting that that's how you felt. I did too grow up in the suburbs, Northern Virginia, right outside of DC, and there was not a huge police presence.
Yeah.
And I did feel very safe.
Absolutely.
So interesting that you brought that up. Thank you for that.
I don't see a lot of police officers in my community. And when I do, I'm usually seeing them doing community service type programs, doing things with young people and hosting sporting events and, fingerprinting kids in case they get lost, things like that make you feel good and make you feel like the police are like a really valuable part of the community. So I think it is possible to have public safety and have police participate in that, but I don't think a police presence is needed to guarantee public safety.
Yeah. How would you like to see police accountability achieved? I know we use the word a lot, but what does that mean? How do we get there?
Yeah, I think as people are waking up to just how distressing this problem is, I think folks want a quick fix. We need to hold them accountable. As long as we hold them accountable, we should be okay. And I think it's going to take a really long time. At the end of the day, this country has right around 17,000 different institutions responsible for justice, policing, et cetera, all across the country. 17,000. And most of policing and, everything connected to public safety, incarceration, et cetera, lands locally. There's over 2 million people in prison in the United States, jail or prison. 1.5 million of those people are incarcerated in local communities. And so because it is primarily a local problem, it's going to take a lot of sustained local activity, first learning about the problem, then advocating for the various solutions, and then supporting the people who can actually put those solutions into practice. And so for people who are interested in accountability, I would look primarily at two things. One, advocate for resources to shift from police budgets to other institutions in your community. The folks who are focused on mental health, the folks who are focused on education and, trauma supports, and really taking care of those who are most vulnerable in your community. And then the second thing is look to support the other officials who can hold police accountable. So one of the big ones, and you may be familiar with this, there's this movement around reform in prosecution. So there are a number of elected reform-oriented prosecutors who are creating new systems for holding the police accountable. So things like, Kim Fox, African-American prosecutor in Chicago, she has created an online system where any member of the public can file a complaint against a police officer, anonymously, and have that sent directly to her office so that you're not forced to go to the police to complain about the police, because that doesn't really feel particularly effective. There are other similar efforts happening in places across the country, but at the end of the day, I think the way we fix this problem is by shifting resources from police budgets to the other things that really do create public safety, and then making sure that we are partnering with and electing and supporting the folks locally in our communities who can actually hold police officers accountable.
You talked about the shifting of budgets. Does that then go under the term that we have now heard as defund the police? I just want to set the record straight on exactly what that means, because I know people have not fully grasped the concept.
So it's funny, I was on a call with a community activist and organizer earlier this week, and she said we should stop saying defund the police, and instead we should say invest in our communities. And that is how I think about it. But technically, if you are shifting resources from, one part of a budget to another part of a budget, yes, you are reducing and therefore defunding the police. I don't think anyone, even some of the folks who I work with who are leading the charge to defund the police, I don't think they envision a world completely devoid of police officers. I think it's more about investing appropriately in communities.
Now here's the heaviest question, and the question with a lot of load to it. Where does race come into all of this? I don't even know how to break that down.
That's a great question. We are dealing with an institution that's rooted in racism. Like policing comes from slave patrols. Like in my mind, the equivalent would be if there was an institution today in Germany that was responsible for keeping people safe, that was based on, how the Nazis operated. Like it literally doesn't make sense. And at its core, unfortunately, it's racist, and we continue to see it play out over and over again. I'll give you a couple of specific examples. In Minneapolis, there was a lawsuit brought against the head of the Minneapolis Police Union by 5 African-American police officers because he had been seen wearing a white power badge on his motorcycle jacket and was assumed to be a part of, a white nationalist organization. That was just a common thing. Like we hear about stuff like that all the time. And then practically how it plays out, Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white men. Is that because Black men are more violent? Like, I don't think so. I think my dad and grandfather and everybody else pretty great. In 2019, of all the traffic stops in this country, 24% of the people stopped were Black and 5% were white. You know, we know these numbers don't make sense when you look at what our country looks like. And, you know, when you know and are in community and related to Black people, or you happen to be Black yourself, you know, you really know it doesn't make sense. And unfortunately, this history of racism and inherent bias has led to a fundamental distrust of police by the Black and brown communities, which then unfortunately leads to increased violence. You know, people would rather take things into their own hands than call the police, because who knows what's going to happen.
We've now talked about the history, we've given people some context, we've broken it down, and at the forefront of this program is the word change. And you talked about it not being a quick fix, and I always believe change is in the eye of the beholder. Like, you all with the Justice Collaborative could do some great work, but somebody else could say, that's not really progress, right? Whereas I could see it as a huge step. Like, we all have this different perspective. Where have you already seen meaningful change start to occur? What are you all doing?
Yeah, so, you know, the example of Kim Fox and that system of reporting to increase accountability. There's also a lot of great work being led by Wesley Bell, prosecutor in St. Louis, you know, doing similar work to increase accountability and transparency. He actually set up an independent unit within his prosecutor's office that is specifically dedicated to prosecuting police misconduct and use of force cases. Around the shifting of resources, we've seen some great work in Austin, Texas, and also more recently in Los Angeles. You know, there was this big men's jail that was supposed to be built, I believe, starting next year, and a local campaign led by a number of advocates and activists wound up transforming that project into a mental health facility. So again, you know, getting back to community investment. So there are very real and meaningful things happening. And I will say, while I believe the deep and sustainable work to transform policing in this country is going to take time, because, you know, in part, the institution has been around for hundreds of years, back during slave times. You know, the first slave patrols were in like early 1700s. Having said that, I think the fact that these aspects of the conversation that had really been on the margins before, you know, people saying things like defund the police, entities and organizations like the NBA and, you know, various corporate actors getting involved in this conversation around, you know, Black Lives Matter and police reform and police accountability is huge. You know, I am 37 years old, and I think this is the most momentum I have personally seen around these issues in my life. So while I am telling everyone it's going to take a while and, you know, commit for the long haul, I do think we're seeing progress by having conversations like these.
And there's been a lot of not just conversations, but within the NBA, the messaging has been clear. The players have protested. At the same time, though, like, sometimes they feel like it's not working because maybe tangible things right in their face aren't happening. But how much would you encourage people to keep on going? What kind of difference do those actions make?
Oh, they make a huge difference. Like, at the end of the day, it is because of the actions of lots of individuals that we're having this conversation, that things like the Justice in Policing Act, you know, passed the House this summer, that the Breathe Act exists, that police reform and Black Lives Matter and all of these different topics are now being highlighted in our presidential race. Like, it is absolutely making a difference. It is having an impact, and especially, you know, for athletes and entertainers and other folks with a big platform, like, we need you to keep at it, because otherwise, you know, we're not going to reach as many people around, you know, change and what they can do and how they can do it and who they should be engaging with as we would otherwise. Like, your voices are critically important in this conversation.
In addition to talking, messaging, protesting, what are some other actionable items that people at home itching to help can do?
I think people who are itching to help and want to get involved The first thing that I would do is, because as we've discussed, so much of this work lands locally, find the organization in your community that's been at it for years and could benefit from either, your financial resources, your volunteer time, your advocacy, whatever it is. Because while there are a lot of people who are just now really beginning to understand how deep and pervasive these problems are, there are also a lot of people who have been fighting them for decades. And so figure out who those people are and team up with them. This is all about teamwork and how we can get at change. And when we take people's energy and, like this new sense of attention and urgency to this problem and apply it to the folks who've already been doing the work, that helps move the ball a lot faster.
You talked about a lot of change that we're seeing right now is at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the federal level come into this? Why is it important maybe for us to see change nationally too?
So that's a great question. So the federal level, there are two things that I would advise folks to keep an eye on. One is the Justice and Policing Act that I just referenced that passed the House this summer. And then the other is the Breathe Act. And then the third thing that I will say is, as an alumni of the Obama administration, I can talk a lot about the things that our Justice Department did. President Obama was incredibly proactive around these issues and made them a core part of his presidency. And his Department of Justice actually, went into local communities and at least attempted to do the work to hold local police departments accountable in cities all across the country. And so while the vast majority, I can't emphasize this enough, of the control of the criminal legal system exists in local communities, there is an important role that the federal government can play in terms of, messaging and, what they do with resources out of DOJ and how the Justice Department engages with and interacts and attempts to hold, local police departments and other local institutions accountable. So, who ends up in the White House is a factor in this conversation around, policing and police reform and accountability.
I so appreciate your insight and giving us just an example of the things that we can do in our community. We're coming to the end of our conversation, but I promised the people that we would answer this one question. So now I pose to you, when does all the teamwork really lead to change?
I think the teamwork leads to change right now. If everyone who's watching this session takes, one action, identifies one thing from our conversation and actually goes and does it, those things ladder up to real meaningful change. Individuals really do matter, especially when we're talking about a system that is so local. I cannot emphasize this enough, but having done a lot of work around district attorney races, oftentimes those elections are won by hundreds of votes, maybe a few thousand. So if you think your individual vote in those down ballot races can't have an impact on the reform that you want to see, you're wrong. It absolutely has a meaningful impact. So decide what step you're going to take today and take it.
Voting matters, talking matters, messaging matters, your voice matters. Marisa, thank you again. Mission accomplished in my mind. You dropped some knowledge and then charged us all to act, team up for change. Thank you for your vision and for this platform. Now let's go be about it.